Okay, next question. Thank you, Sheikh. I'm wondering if you could clarify the relationship between verse 9 and verses 14 and 15. If I understood correctly, you said that the hypocrites were considered believers in verse 9, but do they meet the criteria presented in verse 14 and 15? If not, then does the obligation of verse 9 no longer apply? And by apply, I mean to the hypocrites specifically.
Well, nine addresses if an issue of public law, the formal dynamics as far as the state is concerned, if we as far as the dynamics of authority and resolution of conflict so it's like saying, as a matter of law, and this was in fact what developed in the Islamic tradition, right? Is that if you say you're a Muslim, as a matter of law, you're a Muslim. You become entitled to all the rights and obligations that apply to a Muslim. And 9 comes in, and it's as if 9 says, as a matter of law, everyone that says they're a Muslim, it's like everyone that says they're a Muslim, they're a part of the Ummah. The grand concept of an Ummah. You should not, as Muslims, come and say, well, I don't really believe you're a part of the Ummah because I don't really believe your Shahada. This is precisely what we see happens between Shia and Sunnah today, right? I mean, today you speak to so many, unfortunately, so many, and they when they think of an ummah, they're very confused about this. They'll if you're Sunni, you call the Shia the Rafida, and they're not a part of the ummah because you don't take their Shahada seriously. And I'm sure vice versa. It goes both ways, unfortunately. But even in the modern context, we even see worse than that. I mean, look at the way in countries like Egypt or Saudi Arabia or the Emirat, they talk about anyone they suspect of being Ikhwan, Muslim Brotherhood. They are not so. Not only are the Shia not part of the Ummah, but also the Ikhwan are not part of the Ummah. Whoever they label Khawarij are not part of the Ummah. Recently, I've heard so many Sunni Muslims refer to the Ibadis of Oman as not Muslim and not part of the Ummah. But this confusion occurs when you do not distinguish between, which is to every text there is a rational connections that make sense of this text, and it's sort of a supra text to the text itself. The reason that must be applied when reading a text in order to make sense of the text. And so clearly, when it's talking about the fi'atan, it is talking about a formal public law process. Two parties fight. As a matter of law, you should not speculate about their faith, but only concern yourself with ending the conflict, putting in place a process for a peaceful resolution of the conflict, and ultimately the conflict must be resolved on the basis of justice. Why? Because if you don't achieve justice, the conflict will persist. But at a private matter, at a not even a private law matter, but even at the matter of speaking about conscience, understand that although the law takes presumptively, and it's an irrebuttable presumption, treats all those who say they're Muslim as Muslims, and they become a part of the Ummah at the individual private level, you must realize that there is a qualitative difference and a process of growth for you to go from Islam to Iman. So part of when I talk, I'm sure you guys have heard me in the past talk a lot about the importance of legal training, or the importance of training in law. A huge part of why is so you can tell the difference between matters that can be resolved, what falls under the purview of law, what law can deal with, the difference between the logic of law at a public level and ethical moral law that the state or that official organization cannot be involved with. The state cannot pierce into people's conscience and say, you are a real Muslim and you are not a real Muslim. Because we have numerous examples of that. The Prophet ﷺ, although we all know that if Allah wanted to tell the Prophet precisely, even the Prophet, knowing someone like Abdullah ibn Ubay, that he was the head of the hypocrites, but as a matter of law, the state represented by the Prophet never excluded the hypocrites from their position as part of the Ummah. Although they hurt the Ummah and they maligned the Prophet himself. They attacked the Prophet directly. At the same time, many of us, if you ask us, do you believe someone like Ali bin Abi Talib, did he believe that someone like Abdullah ibn Ubay will probably end in hellfire? I personally believe that that's what Ali bin Abi Talib believed about Abdullah ibn Ubay, that he will probably end up in hellfire. But although I believe that he believed that Abdullah ibn Ubay will probably end up in hellfire, and although I believe that Abdullah ibn Ubay will probably end up in hellfire, but as a matter of law, throughout his life, he was treated as a Muslim citizen. And his rights as a Muslim citizen were never taken away. Although he did things that really push my level of tolerance, like withdrawing from battle, right in the march to battle, when he withdraws in Uhud with a big chunk of the army. That to me sounds like treason, and the fact that the Prophet tolerated it really, a long time ago, I'll tell you, I once gave a lecture, it was at the British University in Cairo. It was an invited lecture. This is before the revolution, before Sisi and all when there was still little space for. So I was talking about the idea of dissent, and I was giving many examples about the notion of dissent in Medina, and that the unmistakable and undeniable phenomena that many people took the Shahada but missed prayers, didn't come to prayer, although they lived in Medina, that many people spoke ill of the Prophet. Many people spoke ill of the Prophet and the companions, that they did, and I was giving, and then I was talking about how the model of Medina dealt with Mecca when Mecca converted to Islam, because now the challenge in Medina doubled, or even more than double, multiplied manifold, because in Mecca many people, like Hind, the woman who killed the Prophet's uncle, converted, or like Muawiyah himself, converted. Yes, sure, they converted, but it is naive to assume that Hind converted and became a good Muslim immediately, if ever. We know from, and I was giving many examples of people who converted but continued to drink alcohol, people who converted but continued to criticize the Prophet in Mecca, people who did it, and so on and so forth. And after I finished this lecture, there was one of the bearded, he clearly belonged to Jama'at, sitting in the audience, and he came to me and said, your lecture was very interesting, but it is completely unrealistic and naive. The Prophet might have shown this level of tolerance towards dissent because he was a prophet, and God guaranteed his success and guaranteed to protect him. But it would be idiotic for anyone in our age. And I said, well, how about following the Sunnah? He said, well, this is not following the Sunnah because he was a prophet. And so here, the logic of exceptionalism is used very selectively. So, when you follow the Prophet when it comes to certain things, that's good. But other things, well, it's because he's a prophet, so we shouldn't follow him. There are layers of the lessons of how the Prophet ﷺ, under Quranic guidance, dealt with dissent, tells us a great deal about the dynamics of law, authority, legal coercion, and the state, and things like privacy, things like jurisdiction of law, but they were not sufficiently developed by contemporary Muslims. They were explored to the extent they could be explored in the pre-modern era, and they were left wherever they were, developed to different levels of maturity by different figures, and then just left where they are until this sort of long interruption, the colonial era, that in which Islamic tradition sort of became just an apologetic, defensive tradition rather than a living tradition.